Russia is a shadow of the Soviet Union. It is going to be a vassal state. It already is. It's a vassal state of China, and there's no way they're going to dig their way out of that one anytime soon. There was this wonderful.
They say that in war, truth is the first casualty. But in the case of modern Russia, the first casualty was its future. You are likely looking at the maps of the Ukrainian frontline right now. You are counting the destroyed tanks, tracking the missile strikes, and analyzing the daily shifts in territory. You are asking who is winning the battle. But this focus is a strategic illusion. The reality, exposed by the cold, hard logic of economics and grand strategy, is much simpler and far more devastating. Russia is already toast. This is not a prediction of what will happen on the battlefield tomorrow. It is a diagnosis of a terminal condition that was signed and sealed years ago. To understand why Putin has already lost, regardless of where the border lines are eventually drawn, we must strip away the propaganda and look at the undeniable data. The decline of Russia from a superpower to a subservient state is perhaps the most dramatic geopolitical collapse of our lifetime. Let's look at the numbers, because math is a universal language that does not lie. Go back to 1980. At that time, the Soviet Union was a true titan. Its GDP was 6 times larger than that of China. Moscow was the undisputed center of the Eastern Bloc, and Beijing was the developing neighbor looking inward. Now, fast forward to today. The tables have not just turned, they have been completely overturned. Today, China's gross national product is 14 times that of Russia. Let that number sink in. 14 times. In the ruthless calculus of international relations, a country with an economy 1/14 the size of its neighbor is not a strategic partner. It is a vassal. Russia has effectively become a vassal state of China. It is a resource colony, destined to supply raw materials to the Chinese industrial machine while lacking the capital and technology to develop its own future. This was not an inevitable historical accident. It was a choice, a series of pivotal errors made by leadership that misunderstood the modern world. This brings us to the core concept that explains this suicide, the clash between the continental and the maritime views of power. Vladimir Putin acts as a classic continentalist. His worldview is akin to a 19th-century real estate developer or an imperial czar. To a continentalist, power is physical. It is measured in acreage. You build a massive army, you cross borders, you take territory, and you physically dominate your neighbors. It is an anachronistic way of organizing a country, a relic of a time before the Industrial Revolution and the globalized economy. Opposing this is the maritime paradigm, the system that the United States and Europe built after World War II. This system proved that true power comes from compounding wealth, building institutions, and adhering to international law. It is about trade, connectivity, and efficiency. By launching a territorial war in Ukraine, Putin tried to play a 19th-century game in a 21st-century world. He rejected the maritime system that generates wealth and chose the continental path that destroys it. He didn't just start a war, he severed Russia from the arteries of global prosperity, leaving it isolated, impoverished, and permanently subordinate to the rising power in the East. Imagine for a moment that you win the lottery. You are handed billions of dollars with no strings attached. You have 2 choices. You can invest that money to build a business that generates wealth for generations, or you can buy expensive weapons to fight your neighbors until the money runs out. In the early 2000s, Russia won the geopolitical lottery, and Vladimir Putin made his choice. To understand the tragedy of modern Russia, we must look back at the early 2000s. This was a moment of unprecedented opportunity. After the chaos and poverty of the 1990s following the Soviet collapse, global oil prices began to skyrocket. Petrodollars flooded into Moscow. For the first time in decades, Russia had the capital to transform itself from a broken empire into a modern, prosperous nation. This was the strategic window. As Professor Paine points out, that was the moment to clear out the corrupt legal system. It was the time to build a judiciary that protected small businesses rather than allowing protection rackets to drain them. It was the time to pave roads, modernize hospitals, and diversify the economy beyond resource extraction. Had Russia taken this path, the path of institution building, it could have integrated into the global economy as a powerhouse, not just a gas station. But Putin did not rise to power on a platform of legal reform or economic diversification. He rose to power on what Paine calls a diet of wars. His legitimacy was not built on prosperity, but on the restoration of a specific kind of hard power. It began with the Second Chechen War, where he leveled Grozny to keep Chechnya within the Russian fold. It continued with the 2008 invasion of Georgia to seize South Ossetia and Abkhazia. At the time, these wars seemed like masterstrokes. They were popular domestically. They coincided with high oil prices, creating an illusion that Russia could have it all: military expansion abroad and rising living standards at home. The Russian people felt wealthier, and their leader looked strong. But this was a trap. The prosperity was not structural, it was cyclical. It depended entirely on the price of a barrel of oil remaining at historic highs. When you build a regime on a diet of wars, you need enemies to sustain it. You need constant conflict to justify the centralized power. But wars are incredibly expensive consumers of capital. Instead of investing in the technology to extract oil from difficult fields in the Arctic, technology Russia desperately lacks and used to get from the West, Putin poured the national treasure into armaments. The pivotal error became clear after 2014, with the first invasion of Ukraine. Oil prices fluctuated, but the sanctions regime began to bite. Russia needed Western capital and technology to modernize its energy sector, but its continentalist aggression cut off those lifelines. Now, the money that should have secured Russia's economic future is literally being blown up in the fields of the Donbass. Russia is burning its cash reserves on artillery shells while its economic engine rusts. The lottery winnings are gone, and the bill is coming due. What if I told you that the war in Ukraine is not actually about NATO expansion, historical grievances, or even about Ukraine itself? At its core, this is a conflict between two incompatible operating systems for the world. To understand why Russia is failing, you have to understand that Vladimir Putin is playing a board game that ended in 1945. This brings us to the most critical concept in modern geopolitics, the distinction between the continentalist and the maritime paradigms. This isn't just academic jargon, it is the difference between poverty and unimaginable wealth. The continentalist view is the oldest way nations have organized themselves. Think of it like a ruthless real estate developer or a feudal lord. In this worldview, wealth is finite. It is physical. It is land. To get richer, you must take something from your neighbor. You build a big army, you invade, and you annex territory. It is a zero-sum game. For me to win, you must lose. This approach relies on spheres of influence, where powerful nations carve up the map and dictate terms to the smaller nations within their orbit. As Professor Paine notes, continentalists love to sit in a room and divvy up the world. You get this, I get that, but they rarely stick to the deal. Because their entire system is based on might makes right, they inevitably try to poach each other's territory. Opposing this is the maritime paradigm, a revolutionary system championed by the United States and its allies after World War II. The generation that survived two global wars realized that the continental way of doing things was insane. Industrialized warfare had become too efficient at killing, fighting over land was no longer profitable, it was suicidal. So, they built a new order based on institutions, international law, and global trade. In the maritime system, wealth is not seized, it is compounded. Instead of soldiers seizing grain fields, you have diplomats and lawyers negotiating trade deals. This lowers the transaction costs of doing business. When you have the rule of law, not just for the powerful, but for everyone, contracts are honored, investments are safe, and economies grow together. This is the magic of the post-World War II era. It replaced the zero-sum game of conquest with the positive-sum game of global commerce. Russia's tragedy is that its leadership views this maritime world order not as an engine of prosperity, but as a threat. Putin looks at international law and sees it as a trick. He prefers the Roman Empire model: we make the rules, and the rules only apply to us. By invading Ukraine, he is trying to enforce a 19th-century sphere of influence in a 21st-century global economy. The evidence of which system works is visible from space. Look at the regions occupied by continental powers today. Whether it is the ruins of the Donbass or other conflict zones, they are leveled. Destruction is the currency of the continentalist. Now look at the maritime world. Despite its flaws, it has generated the greatest accumulation of wealth and stability in human history. By rejecting this system, Putin hasn't just started a war, he has unplugged Russia from the only machine capable of generating long-term prosperity. He is fighting for a slice of the pie while the rest of the world is busy baking a bigger one. History teaches us a brutal lesson: you can be a feared empire, or you can be a rich nation. You rarely get to be both for long. Vladimir Putin wants to be Peter the Great, expanding his borders with cannon fire. But in doing so, according to Professor Paine, he has dragged Russia back to a much darker era, the era of the Mongol yoke. Why does a country with the world's largest natural resource reserves have an economy smaller than the state of Texas? The answer isn't just sanctions. It is something far more rotten at the core of the Russian system. Let's dismantle the economic engine of a continentalist power. Why did the maritime order, led by the US and Europe after World War II, generate such explosive wealth? Professor Paine gives us the answer, and it is surprisingly mundane: lawyers. In the maritime world, when two powers disagree, they send diplomats and lawyers. They sign contracts. They use international institutions. This sounds boring, but it is the secret to prosperity. It lowers what economists call transaction costs. When you don't have to arm your merchant ships or fear that your factory will be seized by a warlord, you invest. You innovate. Wealth compounds. Now, look at Russia. Putin rejected this boring rule of law for the excitement of raw power. But raw power is incredibly expensive. In Russia, there is no true rule of law, there is only the rule of the strong. Paine illustrates this vividly. In Russia, you don't have a legal system that protects small businesses. Instead, you have a protection person, a bureaucrat or an FSB officer, trying to take your money. When a business owner knows that any profit they make can be seized by the state or a corrupt official, they stop investing. They move their money abroad. They flee. This is why Russia cannot diversify its economy. It is not that they can't build technology, it is that the system punishes the kind of innovation required to create it. Capital is a coward, as the saying goes, it runs from places where it isn't safe. This leads to a profound historical divergence between Russia and its new master, China. Even though both are authoritarian, Paine points out a critical difference: China has a commercial tradition. Since the days of the Silk Road, China has been a manufacturer, a trader, a hub of commerce. They understand the value of exchange. Russia, however, lacks this vibrant commercial DNA. By isolating itself from the West, Russia is reverting to the Mongol yoke model. This refers to the historical period when Russia was a vassal to the Mongol Empire, existing only to pay tribute. Today, the dynamic is eerily similar, but the master has changed. Russia is not producing value, it is extracting resources to pay for its survival and its wars. The continentalist game of dividing the world into spheres of influence sounds powerful, but it is actually a recipe for poverty. As Paine notes, continentalists rarely stick to their deals. They are always trying to poach each other's stuff. This creates a high-friction environment where trust is zero and the cost of doing business is infinite. By choosing this path, Putin has condemned ordinary Russians to a future of stagnation, where the only growth industry is the production of artillery shells, and the only export is fear. If Russia is dying from a violent heart attack caused by imperial overreach, the United States is suffering from a slow, self-inflicted poisoning. We have spent the last few minutes analyzing Putin's failure. but it would be intellectually dishonest not to turn the mirror on Washington. According to Professor Paine, while Russia collapses, the United States is taking a disastrous timeout from global leadership. And the root cause is not what you hear on the nightly news. It isn't immigrants, and it isn't foreign adversaries. It is the tax code. We are witnessing a rejection of globalism in the U.S., a retreat from the very maritime system that made America wealthy. But why? The anger in American society is real, but its target is often misplaced. Professor Paine offers a hypothesis that cuts through the partisan noise. Look at the billionaire class. In the last 15 years, we have seen an explosion in the number of multi-billionaires. Where did this sudden accumulation of extreme wealth come from? It didn't appear by magic. It is the result of a broken tax code that essentially functions as a wealth transfer machine. Here is the heist that Paine describes. The wealthiest individuals and corporations often pay a lower effective tax rate than the working class. They utilize specific provisions carved out for their industries, provisions that neither political party is willing to touch. This means the people who benefit most from American infrastructure, the roads, the legal system, the defense umbrella, are not paying their fair share to maintain it. But it gets worse. This isn't just about taxes, it is about subsidies for the rich disguised as welfare. Consider major corporations like Amazon or Walmart, as cited in the analysis. Many of their full-time workers are paid so little that they qualify for food stamps and government assistance. Think about what that actually means. It means the U.S. taxpayer is subsidizing the payroll of profitable corporations. It means the government is picking up the tab so that billionaires can keep wages low and stock prices high. This is the grift. This is the systemic rot that is hollowing out the American middle class. Yet, instead of fixing this economic injustice, Americans are tearing each other apart over culture wars. We fight over who uses which bathroom or who gets on the soccer team. These are distractions. As Paine notes, these emotional battles do nothing to stop the heist. They keep the population divided and angry at each other, while the structural looting of the economy continues unchecked. This domestic rot has strategic consequences. A divided, economically anxious America cannot lead the world. It retreats. It becomes continentalist in its thinking, transactional, fearful, and protectionist. And when the global policeman takes a time out to fight with himself, the world becomes a much more dangerous place. We are making ourselves weaker at the exact moment our adversaries are making their move. The question is, will America wake up to the real problem before the timeout becomes a permanent retirement? We live in a world that is essentially sitting on a powder keg, and everyone seems to be holding a lit match. If the economic collapse of Russia is a tragedy of calculation, the internal unraveling of the United States is a tragedy of emotion. We are witnessing a terrifying phenomenon where societies and leaders are no longer looking for solutions, but are actively looking for a crisis. They are looking for an excuse to pull the trigger. Professor Paine draws a haunting parallel between a domestic tragedy and international geopolitics. She points to a shooting in Minnesota, where a dispute escalated until a mother of 3 was killed, as a microcosm of the current American psyche. It represents a profound sorrow. It is a sign of a society that is downwardly spiraling, where citizens are so quick to kill each other over minor grievances. When a society loses the ability to de-escalate, when the immediate instinct is to destroy rather than to resolve, that society is in deep trouble. This domestic rage bleeds into how we understand history and foreign affairs. Paine recalls the famous photograph from the Vietnam War of a South Vietnamese officer executing a Viet Cong prisoner in the street. For decades, this image was used to illustrate the inhumanity of the South Vietnamese. But context matters. The prisoner had reportedly just murdered the officer's family or villagers. This does not justify the execution, but it complicates the narrative. It forces us to ask, are we reacting to the image, or do we understand the reality? In today's geopolitical climate, this rush to judgment and lack of context creates a fertile ground for catastrophic miscalculation. We saw this recently when the Kremlin claimed Ukraine targeted Putin's residence with a drone. Whether it was a false flag or a real attempt is almost irrelevant. The danger lies in the reaction. If a leader like Trump or any Western official believes a false narrative and responds impulsively, we could see an escalation that no one intended. This is the nightmare scenario. We have a Russian leadership that is paranoid and cornered, willing to interpret any action as an existential threat. We have a Western public that is polarized and often fueled by emotion rather than strategic logic. And we have a fog of war where misinformation travels faster than truth. When nations and neighbors stop giving each other the benefit of the doubt, when miscalculation becomes the norm rather than the exception, the guardrails of civilization begin to buckle. We are seeing this in the streets of America and on the battlefields of Ukraine. The strategic bleed is real. If the United States continues to burn its social cohesion at home while burning its alliances abroad, it leaves the door wide open for adversaries who are disciplined, patient, and waiting for us to destroy ourselves. The greatest threat we face might not be a nuclear missile, but our own inability to pause, think, and de-escalate before it is too late. Imagine building your entire economic house out of ice, just as your neighbor begins to mass-produce flamethrowers. This is the precise strategic nightmare Russia faces today, and it is unfolding in silence, far away from the front lines of Ukraine. While Putin bets his nation's survival on selling oil and gas to the east, he fails to see the trap closing around him. China doesn't just want to buy Russian energy, China wants to make it obsolete. Professor Paine highlights a critical divergence in the long-term visions of Moscow and Beijing. Russia is a petrostate, its heart beats to the rhythm of oil barrels. But China? China is energy insecure. They don't have enough oil, and they know it is a strategic vulnerability. That is why, as Paine notes, China has no interest in maintaining a global petroeconomy forever. Instead, they are positioning themselves to be the movers and shakers of the Green Revolution. This isn't about saving the polar bears. It is about hard power. By dominating the supply chains for solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, China moves the world away from a resource they lack, oil, to a technology they control, green tech. Where does this leave Russia? It leaves them holding a stranded asset. Putin squandered the years of high oil prices on wars instead of diversification. Now, he is locked into a partnership with a country that is actively engineering a future where Russia's primary export is less relevant. It is the ultimate strategic irony. Russia is fueling the very engine that will eventually leave it behind. This leads us to the most haunting concept in Professor Paine's analysis, the pivotal error. We all make mistakes. Nations make mistakes. But a pivotal error is different. It is a decision that alters the trajectory of history so profoundly that there is no turning back. There is no Control-Z in geopolitics. For Russia, the invasion of Ukraine was this error. Paine explains it simply: there is no going back to the status quo ante. The choices available to Russia now are infinitely worse than the choices they had before the war. They cannot simply withdraw and go back to selling gas to Germany. That trust is shattered. The pipelines are blown. The markets are gone. Russia is now trapped in a corridor that leads only one way, deeper into isolation from the West and deeper into subservience to the East. They have burned the bridges to the maritime world, and the continental path they have chosen leads to a dead end. In the final part of our series, we will look at the only variable left, the biological clock of the dictator himself, and what happens when the strong man is no longer strong. We end this series with the only certainty left in Russian politics. Vladimir Putin has built a system that revolves entirely around himself. He has eliminated rivals, silenced dissent, and centralized all decision-making. But there is one enemy he cannot imprison, poison, or invade: time. As Professor Paine bluntly reminds us, the man is going to die. It is a biological fact that carries immense geopolitical weight. Whether he dies in his bed, suffers a massive stroke from the crushing pressure of a failing war, or faces a more violent end, the result is the same. The Putin era has a hard expiration date. The tragedy of a personalized dictatorship is that it lacks a mechanism for succession. In a democracy, when a leader fails or passes away, there is an election. It may be messy, but the system survives. In a regime like Putin's, succession is a crisis. Paine draws a chilling parallel to the death of Stalin. When Stalin died, he reportedly hit the floor with a thud in his private quarters, but his guards were so terrified of him that no one dared to open the door for hours. We are approaching a similar moment in Moscow. When Putin is gone, there will be no orderly transition. There will be, in Paine's words, a no-holds-barred fight for power. The elites, the FSB, the military, the private mercenaries, and the oligarchs will turn on each other to secure their survival and their assets. This looming instability forces us to ask, what is the plan? For years, the West has focused on how to deal with Putin. But we are woefully unprepared for the day after Putin. If a power struggle erupts in a nation with thousands of nuclear warheads, the concept of victory becomes very complicated. The aftermath will likely not be a democratic awakening. The systems of civil society have been hollowed out. The promising people who could have built a modern Russia have largely fled. What remains is a state that will likely solidify its role as a junior partner, a vassal, to China. The Russia that emerges from this chaos will be poorer, angrier, and structurally dependent on Beijing for its economic survival. Conclusion: a civilization suicide. So, what is the final verdict? The historian Arnold Toynbee once famously said, "Civilizations die from suicide, not by murder." This is the story of modern Russia. It was not murdered by NATO expansion. It was not destroyed by Western sanctions. It committed suicide through a series of pivotal errors. It chose the continental path of land conquest over the maritime path of prosperity. It chose the rigidity of dictatorship over the resilience of the rule of law. It chose the past over the future. The lesson for the rest of us, for the United States and Europe, is clear. The maritime order that generates our wealth and freedom is not a law of nature, it is a choice. It requires maintenance. It requires alliances. And it requires us to solve our own internal problems so that we do not follow Russia down the path of self-destruction. Russia is toast because it forgot that in the 21st century, the true measure of power is not how much land you can take, but how much value you can create.